All right, so this is a chapter that I have not been looking forward to going over. Okay, so just an FYI, especially as I did see a couple of youngsters walking in, this chapter is itself full of awkward content, just an FYI. So just want to let you know this will be PG-13 and maybe even a little beyond rated, maybe a little higher than that. Because now we're carrying in the same theme. In one sense, our theme is not going to be different from what it's been for the last few weeks. It's about cleanliness, right? We're going to be talking about cleanliness. But this chapter is specifically about bodily discharges. So we're talking biology and we're talking about biological fluids. And that's tough because, I mean, it's just in the text. That's the thing. It's just in the text. And so I actually did consider skipping it, which I think is okay. I mean, as you guys saw last week, as we were going through these chapters on cleanliness, I haven't covered like every single verse. But typically, if I am fast forwarding through something or if I am skipping over something, my skipping over has to do with the fact that there's a lot of repetition, as you guys have seen. There's a lot of these passages which are regarding the same topics and the same themes. This is the same theme, but it's very different content. And so before we get into the text, I want to kind of come back, because again, this has been the same basic theme for several weeks. I want to come at it again from a new angle this time. And I want you guys, it's actually, a lot of this is drawn from a book that I, like when I was just studying and thinking about this chapter, I stumbled upon a book by a sociologist, which I couldn't even tell when reading it if she was a Christian. But she wrote extensively about the book of Leviticus, which I found super interesting. But in this book, she was talking about dirt and the feelings that we have regarding dirt, and not just dirt, but, well, she uses the word dirt kind of generally speaking of everything that we might think of as like repugnant. You could say dirt, you could say pollution, anything that you would term as gross. And of all the chapters we've looked at regarding cleanliness, I want you to think about this. We've talked about animals, and we've talked about cleanliness in regards to animals. We've talked about childbirth. We talked about cleanliness in regards to childbirth. Last week, we looked at skin diseases, cleanliness in regards to skin diseases. But the cleanliness issue that we're going to be dealing with today is primarily concerned with what is gross. What is gross? And so to just kind of consider this for a second, think about any time when, say, well, actually, here, I'll give you an illustration. I was at this was years ago, at my mother's when she was living on the Oregon coast. And I went to visit her and my cousin. And they were living in a dirty lifestyle. I don't know how else to describe it. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean, it was just dirty. The place was dirty, and I really wrestled with whether or not I should stay with them and like sleep in their home or go get a hotel because it was so dirty and it was hard for me to be in that place. And to illustrate the dirtiness, I always sat on hard surfaces, so I would sit on a hard chair. I didn't want to sit on the soft surfaces, the couches. And one of the reasons was I remember I was sitting once and one of the dogs just started hacking on the couch and then vomited on the couch. Happens, right? Dogs vomit. And I was like, oh, dog vomited. And my cousin said, ugh, grabbed a paper towel and went and just wiped it up and threw it away and said, okay. And I was like, okay, I need more than just a paper towel wiping up the vomit. Like I need something else before I'm gonna be feeling comfortable about sitting down. I need that. And so that's why I was like, hard surfaces, I don't know, a hard surface seems cleaner, right? Like, I mean, it's like you can wash it. And so that's kind of what I mean by this. I mean, if you've ever looked at something and it's typically when it's in that wet state that you're like, that is gross. That is repugnant. That is something that I don't want to touch. And I want to point this out because as we read through this chapter, and I mean, really, be thinking about this in the context of everything we've been talking about. It's clear that the Israelites that were alive during the time of Moses, the ones that were first receiving this law, it's clear that there are certain things that they found repugnant. And some of these things we can't understand because they are culturally relative. Israelites found pigs repugnant. That doesn't make sense to me. I mean, don't get me wrong, as an animal, they're, they don't live in a way that I would want them to live as an animal, I guess. But I mean, in terms of the food, there is no repugnance to me. There is only attraction, right? Pig meat is pure attractiveness. It draws me in, but they found it repugnant. So not all of these things are going to have the same sway. But I do think when it comes to bodily fluids, the repugnance is really easy to understand. I think in our culture today, and I think this might even just be something that is generally true of humankind, we all are very much we are repulsed by bodily fluids. And, I remember, obviously blood being a big one. And part of that is for us, no doubt, informed and influenced by our understanding of bloodborne illnesses, right? I think nowadays people are probably a little bit more concerned not to touch blood than they might have been, say, 80 years ago or something like that. I remember a friend of mine who worked at Albertsons years ago as a cashier. He came home one day kind of frustrated because a man had a seizure while in line, and when he had his seizure, he fell on the ground. He hit his head on the ground, and blood started pouring out. And he was upset because people immediately dispersed. They didn't come to help him. They dispersed to get out of the way. Why? Because they were scared to touch the blood. And they're scared to touch the blood because they're scared to get the bloodborne illnesses, the bloodborne pathogens. At least that's no doubt what they're thinking to a certain degree. I used to work in a hospital. And this is not one of my finer moments, thinking back to it. It's a moment that even that day I really regretted. There was I had a patient. By the way, I was not a trained medical professional, just so you know, so don't ever come to me ask. I was what you call a patient sitter. Patient sitters are low on the totem pole. We were making minimum wage, and we were just sitting there watching. My job was to sit there watching a patient and make sure he didn't hurt himself or anything like that. And there's protocols in there. Typically, the rules are if you are going to touch bedding or something like that, and there is bodily fluid on the bedding, you should put on gloves. Generally speaking, people just did that. In general, people were pretty good about it. I knew enough about this guy because you're typically informed from the previous sitter about whatever medical conditions he has. And the previous sitter told me, hey, just so you know, he has HIV, which immediately in my mind I was like, okay, if I see any fluid, definitely putting gloves on, right? And I remember sitting there, and it really wasn't a big deal. I really didn't think too much about it until the CNA who came in to tend to the man and change his bedding, which had bodily fluids on it, didn't put gloves on. And I was like, and this is why I say it's not one of my finer moments. So the man was sitting right there. I'm like, just so you know. And I told her he has HIV, which I guess, I don't know for sure if I should have said, but at the time I was like, I can't believe you're not putting the gloves on. The idea typically for me, it's like a gut reaction. If I see bodily fluids, I don't want to touch it, right? And that is in some senses, I think in the case of this man who fell and hit his head, and no doubt in certain kind of medical situations, I think you could have this experience. It's unfortunate because what I want you to understand is people are going to feel I know that man felt unclean. You know what I mean by that? What I mean by that is he felt like people wouldn't touch him. I remember in a different capacity as a pastor, I visited a man who was dying of pancreatic cancer. And he was very sick, and I visited him occasionally towards the end of his life, and I'd sit with him. And for the most part, as he deteriorated, I just hold his hand. I really had never met him before. I would just go and meet him because he had come to church here and he wanted me to come. And so I just hold his hand and talk to him. And I remember one of the last times, now, by the way, I used to work in a hospital. So you are trained. It's again, this is part of the cleanliness protocol. You clean your hands always, it's a perpetual thing. And so it's in my head, if I'm touching somebody who's sick, it's in my head, I got to clean my hands. But I remember sitting with this guy holding his hand, I thought, don't clean your hands. I did when I got home, right? But don't clean your hands now. Why? Because I thought he's going to think I'm touching somebody dirty. I didn't want him to think that. And I remember when I left on one of the last days, his wife came up to me crying and she thanked me that I never cleaned my hands after meeting with him. Because she said every person who'd ever come in had always rushed to the bathroom and washed his hands. I'm not trying to say that as if I did like some great thing, because I also had that impulse. I just knew what it would communicate, if that makes sense. So there's an interesting thing here, tension, that I want to point out, that on the one hand, we all have in us this understanding, like deep in our hearts and our minds, that bodily fluids, don't touch them. And it can sit there in the back of your head. It can sit there in the back of your head, and you can it can kind of grain. I've said this before, if I'm in a situation where I've been around something or touched something that seems gross like this, I have to wash my hands. And if I don't, it will nag at me for a while until I find a place where I can wash my hands. That's that uncleanness sitting there. So that's one thing to be keeping in mind. But the other thing I want you to keep in mind is the feeling that people will have when they are untouchable in this sense, because they are unclean. Because I think both of these tensions exist here in this place. And let me kind of back up. As I said a moment ago, I'm going to kind of take a different approach in terms of talking about this. Think back to the book of Genesis, which we haven't been in for a while. I believe we started the book of Genesis in 2021, so a while ago. But think back to the very beginning. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So in verse 1, it says he created the heavens and the earth, first thing. Right after that, it says, and the earth was formless and void. Formless and void. It's a pretty interesting assertion. What it seems to imply is that at the initial creative act, the creation of matter and earth and whatever it was that God made, it was chaotic. Let me put it that way. It was a massive chaos. It had not taken shape. It had not been integrated into its proper and right form. It was chaos. Now I mention this because if you take a look at pretty much any other creative story, like story of creation from ancient religions, although they all differ in many different ways. In fact, the Jewish narrative, the biblical narrative, the Genesis narrative is fundamentally different from most, in that in this narrative, it cites God as the creator, the one who made it all come into place in the first place. Whereas typically, in most of these other narratives, they're not addressing the person who made the matter to begin with. But one thing that is consistent in all of these is that at the beginning, everything that is earth, everything that is the world that we think of, is chaos. Meaning it's not structured, it's not orderly, it's a convoluted mess. And in all of the stories, once you get the chaos, it goes on to explain how the chaos is taken from chaos and turned into order. That is, it's organized and orchestrated in such a way to where it is right and proper and clean, is kind of the idea. And in one sense, you see that in Genesis, how the book of Genesis starts off, but you also see it just with the creation of the nation of Israel. What we're seeing as Moses and these people become a nation, we're seeing a bunch of people who live in a chaotic mess. They have not been a nation. They have not been a nation in the sense that we might tend to think of. They were slaves. They were slaves not in control of their own lives. They were slaves who did not have their own homes, who did not have their own careers, and well, at least not ones of their own choosing. And it's not like things got better initially, in a certain sense. They were freed, and freedom is a great thing, but they were freed to live in the wilderness. And the wilderness, scripturally, is a picture of chaos, and understandably so. Right? If you are in the wilderness, you are in danger. You live amongst creatures that want to kill you and eat you. You live in places where the bushes are not trimmed, they're not hedged, they're constantly serving as something that can hide something that is a threat to you. And I want you to be thinking about this. The wilderness is put forward in Scripture as the opposite of the garden. The wilderness is where you go into chaos when the plant life and the animal life and the things that are out there have not been trimmed and shaped and fashioned and taken from chaos to order. It exists in its chaotic state. But what is the garden? The garden is when a gardener has come in. A person has come in and has taken the plants and has hedged them and trimmed them and fashioned them and formed them into something where there is order, and with order always comes peace. Order leads to peace. And so what is happening to Israel? Israel, which is living in the wilderness, is being made to bring order into its world. We are organizing this chaotic mass of people. And they're going to organize it beyond what we've read so far. We've read about the establishment of the tabernacle and the different chambers of the tabernacle, the holiest place, the holy place, the outer courts, and then outside of there you have the camp of the children of Israel, which we haven't really read about in detail, but where the children of Israel are living in camps. All of this exists in kind of a, depending on which direction you're going, an ascending, as you move in towards the most holy place, an ascending level of orderliness, or a descending level of chaos. Like you're approaching chaos as you move out from the center, and you're approaching order as you move into the center. And if you go outside of the camp, where are you? You are in the wilderness where it is pure chaos. And here I want you to just stop and consider the life of people. I don't know, this is one thing that, generally speaking, in my experience, and I traverse through both of these worlds, this is one thing that I think is a very clear mark of distinction between middle and upper class America and lower class America. Now, I don't want to be reductive, and I don't want to oversimplify and say it's always like this, but I have traversed a lot into lower class America. I say lower class, of course, meaning economically lower class. My family is in lower class America. I grew up in lower class America and have, in many instances, traversed into lower class America. I live myself and I work in middle and upper class America. And one of the things that you can see very clearly if you traverse into these two worlds, a sharp, stark difference is order and chaos. You walk into middle class, upper class, you walk into the home is clean, it is orderly, there is not clutter. Things are organized as you might expect them to be organized. You walk into the bathroom is going to be clean. You walk into, again, like I said, I know this might be reductive and it's not universally the case, but you walk into a house typically which is more lower class, and what do you find? Clutter and garbage and lack of cleanliness. I've seen that in my brother and mom's house. Their house is that way. Every summer I tell myself I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna help them clean it. I'm gonna find a way to clean it. And we start and it just never gets there. It's like, because it's like, even if you get it going, it's like, we're not gonna quite make it, because it'll eventually just devolve right back to it. And I have a tendency towards some of that stuff because I'm not the most disciplined person in the world, and because my lack of discipline can gear you towards chaos. One of the things about this is chaotic environment leads to chaotic thinking. It makes you feel overwhelmed. And I'm speaking about this from experience. Your mind can start being very overwhelmed. And it is amazing how clearly everything can kind of just be resolved by just getting things in order. I actually had a situation. A friend of mine years ago, actually our former lead pastor, Bob, his son, Luke, he was talking to me one day and he goes, hey man, what can I do to really help you in your life? Like, I really want to help you. Now, in particular, at this time, he was specifically focusing on trying to help me figure out my weight issues. And I was like, man, I don't know. And then I remember I said, well, one thing, I do need to get my room clean. My room is in disorder and it makes me feel very disorderly. And he goes, okay. I went to work the next day and I came back and my room was not only clean, he probably went a little overboard. He threw all my stuff away. If you actually know him, you know that that's the kind of stuff he does. He went through, he decided everything that I owned that was unnecessary, and he threw it all in the garbage. And he threw away my bed and bought me a new bed, and he painted the walls of my bedroom. And it was unbelievable walking through those doors, the feeling that I had. And it's not simply like a good feeling, right? It's this incredible sense of peace that is all of a sudden, it descends into your life and it fills your mind, and it, for the first time, makes you feel like, oh, I can kind of think through things, right? I feel like I can start to solve the problems of my life. And I say all of this, guys, because I want you to understand what is going on in Israel is God is creating order where there was disorder. And he's trying to create an orderliness so that his people can function in the world. And I want you to understand that in general, all civilization is trying to do this. You either live outside of civilization, in which case it is chaos and it is disorder, and with that comes danger. Your life is threatened. Or you enter into society and civilization and order and peace descend and you are protected. And you could break everything down into those two simple categories. And I want you to understand, as we read through the scriptures, the Bible is always thinking about these things in that way. To not fit in the orderly world is to live in chaos. So we need to create order. God is order. I'm not saying that orderliness just is God, but what I mean is that is like an attribute that he imposes upon the world that he inhabits. That's why you go back to Genesis 1. In the beginning, the earth was formless and void. And what does he do? He establishes order in the midst of the chaos. And so that's the stuff I want you to keep, those things I want you to keep in mind as we go into this very difficult text. So let's read it. And I'm just going to read it, try to briefly explain. Some of it will be obvious. Actually, quite a bit of it I think will be obvious. Chapter 15, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. Now, discharge here could be any kind of bodily fluid, essentially pouring out of almost any part of your body. I do want to pause here. Generally speaking, in this chapter, when it talks about discharges or flows, it is almost always talking about sex organs. Almost always. Some people argue that there are places where it might be talking about any kind of bodily orifice, which is possible in some of these, but you will see when you read it, you can tell most of it is talking about sex organs. And so here, this is one where it could be talking about any orifice in your body, and it could be talking about any discharge. It could be blood, but it could be other kinds of fluids that might come out of your body. So when a man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. And this shall be his uncleanness in regard to his discharge. Whether his body runs with his discharge, meaning he has a flowing discharge. See, guys, what I meant about this being very gross. Or his body is stopped up by his discharge, that is a blockage of sorts. It is uncleanness. Now, I hope you can hear how matter of fact this is. And it should be obvious that it's matter of fact, because of course, the truth is none of us need to be told these things. This is what I was describing earlier. Bodily fluids on something or somewhere, you look at it and you're like, it's a natural reaction. We can't take it, right? Continue on, verse 4. Every bed is unclean on which he who has the discharge lies, and everything on which he sits shall be unclean. And whoever touches his bed shall... Now, here's the thing. This is why this passage is practically important. For the people living in Israel, then, it is of very little importance to us because we don't function according to these rules in regards to our issues of cleanliness, although some of these would apply. They're things you don't need to really know, right? So notice he says, whoever touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and he will be unclean until evening. So the thing to note is, if you become unclean, what are you supposed to do? Wash. And I know that might seem obvious, but let me drive home again the point that not everybody actually realizes this. Some people have, in fact, learned to cope with uncleanness. I mentioned the poverty thing that I brought up earlier. This weekend, I saw my nephew who is not clean. And I mean that in the strict sense. He doesn't clean himself properly. And I saw him, and I saw something very bad right here. And I was like, Mark, what's my brother? I said, what is that? Is he okay? And he goes, oh, that's dirt. And I'm like, oh, like, dude, just, have him take a bath, like have him wash it. He goes, he never washes his neck. And I'm like, okay, tell him to wash his neck. Like, I say all of this, guys, because the reality is you really can be accustomed to the uncleanness. You can be, and I go back to that example I gave a long time ago when I visited my mom and my cousin. When my cousin took that paper towel and wiped the vomit, she was fine with it. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can become accustomed to the uncleanness. And so what you need to understand here is these laws, as they're written for Israel, have a very practical benefit. Because what is God doing is he is ensuring that the children of Israel are going to teach their children forever, hey, you touch unclean things, wash yourself. Wash yourself. And here's the thing, we've talked about this before. They do not have the knowledge of hygiene we have, right? They don't know the science. But if you stop and think about it, you will realize that we all might think we operate purely on science. We look at that stuff and we go, there could be pathogens in that liquid. There could be diseases in that liquid. We know that viruses and bacteria exist in these things. We know that, and that puts us in a position where we're maybe a little better prepared to deal with it. We know, and therefore we use antibacterial soap. All these things are true, but you guys understand that when you become accustomed to a certain kind of cleanliness, the culture that kind of shapes you in that is not always super right on about how to teach you what is clean. And it is not always rooted in reason. Can I give you an example? Question. How many of you have ever eaten a meal in the bathroom? No hands go up. Very good. Why is that? Probably because you have become accustomed to recognize bathrooms are unclean. Don't eat in the bathroom. This is something I came across, by the way, listening to a podcast in preparation for this. This is not an observation I made before. How many of you store your toothbrush in the bathroom? Where does the toothbrush go? Right in the mouth. Why is it one of those things feels super unclean and one of those things feels super normal? It's just the way we were accustomed, and it's really actually not great. My toothbrush, worst spot ever, I put it on my sink, which I have a tiny bathroom, which means my sink is right next to my toilet. My toothbrush is right in a thing on this side of the counter, sticking out right next to the toilet. You know what that means, right? Every day, for years, brushing my teeth with toothbrushes that are unclean. I told this to my students, and my students said, we put ours in a cabinet. And I go, I don't have a cabinet. They're like, you don't have a cabinet? Or they say, well, you put the little thing on. Yeah, have you ever looked in those things when you put them on your toothbrush? Very unclean. The inside of those things are very unclean. So since I listened to this podcast, I took the toothbrush and moved it to the other side. But, it's like, this is not, like all this to say, guys, our sense of cleanliness and uncleanness, it is learned by our culture, and it is not always rational. And to some degree, that's what God is doing here. He's saying, I'm going to teach you a cleanliness thing, and you just need to learn it, and it doesn't matter if you understand it. And it is going to, in some sense, kind of correlate to how, people naturally react and think about things. Continuing on, verse 7, he who touches the body of him who has the discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Please note what it said. People are unclean, and don't forget, I've said this before, uncleanliness does not mean sinful, okay? These are not necessarily sinful things. You're gonna see this, they're medical things. It's that you're unclean. Important thing to note, and this has been true of everything we've looked at this far, you can touch an unclean thing. But what is required when you touch that unclean thing? Cleaning and time. Cleaning and time. And what happens when the time passes? Then you are clean. And it is meant to, I think, instill hope in people. In this instance, for these discharges he's describing, which we never know exactly what discharges he's talking about. Just so you know, the most common answer I've found in commentators as to what discharges are being talked about amongst men early on here is probably the sexually transmitted disease gonorrhea. That's the thing that most people kind of infer. I don't know, though. That's like a theory. It's kind of like last week when we were looking at the various skin diseases. These are best guesses. These guys are not trained in science. They're describing things. We're trying to figure out what they're describing. A person becomes clean by bathing and by waiting. And there are two different periods typically that lead to cleanness. One is a day, and another is 7 days with a fresh start on the 8th. And what do these things show you? It shows you that while you might be unclean, you can be cleansed. And that's going to be pertinent to something we're going to talk about a little later. Continue verse 8. If he who has the discharge spits on him who is clean, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. He's just covering all the bases. If a guy who is unclean touches you in any way, you're unclean. By the way, spitting on you, yeah, that's going to make you unclean. Also a bodily fluid, also gross, right? Any saddle on which he who has the discharge rides shall be unclean. Please note how it keeps talking about where you sit. That's why people assume that the discharge is one involving the sexual organs. Whoever touches anything that was under him shall be unclean. He who carries any of those things shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. And whomever the one who has the discharge touches and has not rinsed his hands in water, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. The vessel of earth that he who has the discharge touches shall be broken. Every vessel of wood shall be rinsed in water. So if you have an earthen vessel and it touches a man with a discharge, break it, don't ever use it. It's unclean. If it's wooden, clean it, right? So he's just going through practical things that in certain senses aren't necessary for us, right? This is one of the things we've seen as we've gone through the law. A lot of these are not practical things for us to follow. Verse 13, when he who has a discharge is cleansed of the discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing. He will wash his clothes, bathe his body in running water. Running water is cleaner than still water, which you guys, I'm sure, especially if you're a camper or anything like that, you know that, right? If it's still water, then the germs and everything sit in that area. But if it's running water, it's clean, right? Running water, then he shall be clean. On the 8th day, so remember, for some of the uncleanness, it's a 1-day thing. For others, it's an 8-day process. He shall take for himself 2 turtle doves, 2 young pigeons, and come before the Lord to the door of the tabernacle of meeting and give them to the priest. I skipped over last week the offering of the sacrifices for cleaning yourself on a skin disease. You would wash, you would wait, but there's a third thing. In some instances, you would offer sacrifices as a purification. Then the priest shall offer them, the one as a sin offering, the other as a burnt offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord because of the discharge. Now, just so you know, one of the reasons people have used for thinking that the discharge reference is gonorrhea is because a sin offering is being ordered for here. And so people would assume then gonorrhea, sexually transmitted disease, would have probably been received through some kind of sinful act. I don't know if I buy that, because when you look at the different offerings that are given for being unclean, there are times when offerings are demanded in situations where I wouldn't think of them as sinful. But nonetheless, that's what some people will say. Verse 16, forgive me of this. This is not polite church talk, but this is the Bible. So take it up with the man who wrote it. If any man has an emission of semen, then he shall wash all his body in water, and he will be unclean until evening. Now, I used to work at a hotel. You guys know where this is going, right? I had to clean the hotel. I was a kid. It was actually my friend's dad who like ran it. So when we would stay with him, we would have to do the work. And we would talk about it all the time. Every time we go into the room, we're like, we have to change the bed sheets. And so we'd put the gloves on and we'd change, and it was gross because that is unclean, right? You don't need to be taught that. You don't need to know that. There is an uncleanness to it. I want to add, when a person experiences it, they also feel a level of psychological uncleanness, right? There's a sense of uncleanness. Now, just so you know what it's talking about, it could be talking about any number of ways that could lead to that. It could be talking about actual sexual contact. It could be talking about masturbation, things of that nature. It could be anything that might lead to this. But you are unclean, and what do? You wash. Verse 17, and any garment and any leather on which there is semen, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening. Also, when a woman lies with a man and there is an emission of semen, they shall bathe in water and be unclean until evening. By the way, the rule then was if you are unclean, you are not allowed to touch each other. So basically they have sex and then they can't again for a day. So it was kind of a way for maybe slowing down that process a little bit for some people. 19. If a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her body is blood, she shall be set apart 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Now this is, of course, referencing women's menstruation. And again, to really drive this point home, it's not meant to be viewed as sinful. By the way, a man and a woman, provided they're married, having sex is not sinful. So the uncleanness thing is not necessarily sinful. It's just like a factual thing in their minds. This is an uncleanness. I don't need to go into why women's menstruation would be unclean. I just want to drive home just how unclean it is for us as a culture. I'm going to give 2 examples really quickly. You guys all know there's a passage in the book of Isaiah where God, speaking of the righteous acts of Isaiah or of the Israelites, says, your righteousness is as filthy rags to me. Basically, his whole point is, I am not impressed by your righteousness. Your righteousness is polluted. He's using a metaphor there. He's using the metaphor of uncleanness, but he's essentially saying your righteousness isn't really righteous. It's not truly done in my honor. Well, the original term there in Hebrew, filthy rags, is actually referencing menstruation rags. And I remember one time there was a guest speaker who came up, and in my mind, simply knowing that fact is sufficient for trying to drive home the point. You know what I'm talking about? Like, I don't need anything else. That's gross enough. I had another guy, or there was a guy who came up here to speak, and when he spoke on this subject, he referenced that, and then he needed to go into a long illustration about it to further drive home the point. And I just remember sitting there going, this was a guy who I brought in to speak here, and I was like, this is horrible. No need for that. Absolutely no need for that. Another example that I would give, and this one I just want to use to just point out how uncomfortable we are even talking about. It's not just about whether or not the reality is kind of like unclean in our cultural sense, but the way that we even feel about talking about it. Years ago, I'm a teacher. I'm a male teacher, right? Of high schoolers. I have adolescent kids in my classes. And I remember one day there was a girl talking, and I'm like, hey, stop talking. And then she's like, and then she kind of looked at me, and then she was like, and I was like, what are you doing? I just asked you to stop talking. She's like, she got in trouble. I didn't think anything of it again until after she graduated. And then after graduation, she was talking. She was like, yeah, you know, Mr. Velasco, that one time when you got mad at me for talking, I'm like, well, I wasn't really mad. I just wanted you to stop talking. I couldn't think why you wouldn't. She goes, I was dealing with this and I needed help. She didn't feel comfortable telling me, and rightfully so, right there in front of the whole class. And it's something I'd never even thought about. It's something I had never even considered when addressing it. So it's like, it's a thing that people don't even want to talk about. That's how and by the way, the passage I just referenced about emissions of semen, I was giving a provision, a disclaimer, but I'm like, yeah, we don't want to talk about it. We don't feel comfortable talking about it. Parents don't feel comfortable talking about it to their kids. I have a student right now, I think I mentioned this last week or something like that. She's writing her thesis on the need for sex education in schools. And she said, you know, Mr. Velasco, some parents don't talk to their kids about them. Like, I know, like mine, never once. My father has never in my entire life once broached this subject with me, right? And by the way, I tend to think probably throughout much of church history and much of culture, that's true. What I love about this, and let me just kind of add this as like a thing, in this text, as uncomfortable as it might be, God saw fit to discuss it. He sees fit to say, you know what, we actually can talk about this. And although it's in a context wildly different from what you and I have experienced, it is that very subject. And I think it does give us license to say we should discuss it in proper contexts. I'm only talking about it to this extent here because I do think in general the pulpit is not the best place to discuss it in detail. But I do want to cover it in the text. Let me go a little further. Whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, be unclean until evening. Whoever touches anything she sat on shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. If anything is on her bed or anything which she sits when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. And if any man lies with her at all so that her impurity is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. So she is unclean, and anybody she touches is unclean, and they both have to go through this process of ritual cleanness. Now, let me remind you, if you are unclean, one of the requirements is you don't touch each other, but also you don't go into the house of God and worship, right? There's supposed to be a period of cleansing. You become clean, then you can enter in to the house of God. Verse 25. If a woman has a discharge, before I get to this, there is a story that demonstrates to us that this idea that they're talking about here goes beyond this text. It's not like with this law, God is establishing a rule of cleanness for women on their period. He's really addressing something that has already been in the minds of the people. And by the way, if you go and you look at ancient laws of other cultures, you will find the same kinds of things. But if you go back to the book of Genesis, we actually read it as we were going through the story. We read about Jacob when Jacob fled from Laban. When Jacob fled from Laban, his uncle took his 2 wives with him. And as they were fleeing, if you recall, Laban chases after them. And Jacob's wife, Rachel, had stolen the household gods. And do you guys remember, Laban tracks him down and says, dude, why did you leave? Like, you're my son-in-law, those are my daughters. Like, I want to say goodbye. And Jacob's frank. He's like, look, I don't think you're a fair man, and I think you would have tried to force us to stay. And he goes, no, I wouldn't have done that. And then he goes, but also, why did you steal my gods? And Jacob's like, I didn't steal your gods. He didn't, Rachel did. So he's like, check my house. Anybody who's taken your gods, you can kill them. Laban doesn't realize it's his own daughter. He goes in, he checks all the tents looking for his household gods, goes into Rachel's tent, and Rachel, famously, is seated on a saddle, which it mentions here, in which the gods are being held. And when he walks in, she says, Father, please forgive me. I'm not going to rise and greet you because it's my time of the month. So that's long before Moses. It's already something in their thinking. And therefore, he doesn't look in the saddle. He doesn't find the gods. So it's a verse that references back to that very thing. So let's go a little bit further. Continuing verse 25. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days other than at the time of her customary impurity, or if it runs beyond her usual time of impurity, all the days of her unclean discharge shall be the days of her customary impurity. In other words, if she has a medical condition where she essentially continues to bleed for long periods of time, which is something which there are conditions which lead to that, then she is going to be unclean until she stops bleeding, is the idea. She shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies, all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity, and whatever she sits on shall be unclean as the uncleanness of her impurity. Whoever touches those things shall be unclean. He shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. So the same rituals. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, that means if she stops, then she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. And on the 8th day she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, bring them to the priest to the door of the tabernacle. The priest shall offer the one as a sin offering, the other as a burnt offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord. Here's a great example of what I just pointed out. Now, of all the things we just looked at, the first discharge that is mentioned requires a sacrifice. This discharge requires a sacrifice. The other ones, an emission of semen, a sexual contact, and the regular menstruation do not require a sacrifice. This is why I think it's hard to use as an argument that the first one must be a venereal disease and sacrifice was required for sin, because there's no way that what is implied by this woman having an irregular menstruation, that she's sinning. The sacrifice is a part of the cleaning process, and I don't know why you pick it for some and not for others. There's a lot of what we might tend to think of as randomness in the way these things are. I don't think it's random. I think God had a reason for everything, but he just chose to not necessarily give us his reasons, right? Verse 31, thus you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. Guys, I know it's been several weeks, But remember the context of what we've been reading about in uncleanness. What is the last historical event we looked at? It was the sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, doing something unclean, or profane, I should say. And in doing something profane, being struck dead when entering the tabernacle. That's what we've been reading. In other words, what is God doing? God said, okay, we're going to set down the rules so nobody does something that results in their dying. And so he's saying, don't do this stuff because I want you to be clean. And it's all rooted in this whole idea of the concentric circles that I've been talking about. Outside is chaos, dirt, filth, pollution. Inside is holiness, cleanliness, sanctity. It's all symbolic. This is the law, verse 32, for one who has a discharge, and for him who emits semen and is unclean thereby, and for her who is indisposed because of her customary impurity, and for one who has a discharge, either man or woman, and for him who lies with her who is unclean. Okay, let's talk about kind of I think what we can take as applications from this, and I think there are many real world applications. On the one hand, very clearly, most of us do not need to worry about or concern ourselves with the applications that God intended for the children of Israel in that day, in that age, at that time. We are not the children of Israel, and these are not rules that are laid down for us so that we can enter the temple or the tabernacle. So what do we take away from it? Well, first of all, let me remind you of a couple of very important verses that I've gone over with you a bunch, but I always want you to have in the back of your mind. I'm not going to go into detail, but I just want to remind you of Galatians chapter 3, verses 21 through 24, Romans 7:7, wherein they explain to us the purpose of the law. What is the purpose of the law? In Galatians, it says that the law cannot make us righteous, it cannot make us pure, it cannot make us holy. What is it? It's a tutor to bring us to Christ. What does the book of Romans chapter 7 say? It says, we would not have known sin if the law had not told us it was sin. What is the purpose of the law? It is to show us, in varying degrees, the fact that we cannot be pure and perfect and holy. So any Israelite living in this world would go, like every woman would go, once a month at least, I'm unclean. Actually, just so you know, this is something I was reading up on. Menstruation in antiquity and amongst Israel would actually be a lot rarer than it is today for a number of reasons. It would not typically be once a month. The main reason being women would marry quite young and they would start having children almost immediately, and they would have children almost repeatedly until menopause. Right? So the reality is there just weren't actually a ton of times in which they would they would just be pregnant all the time. But don't worry, they will be unclean when they give childbirth, when they engage in childbirth, right? So it's like, but my point is that a woman would have to sit there and say, I am always unclean, constantly. And understand that there is a purpose in that. It is, in fact, trying to drive home this point that there is nothing that we can do and there is no way that we can conduct ourselves. It is completely hopeless if your goal is to sit there and say, I'm going to be perfect, righteous, pure, holy, and all of these things. You will never be that. And what does that mean? It means you need to be cleansed. And what is the thing that is provided time and again in all these examples we've read? Cleansing. Cleansing, cleansing, cleansing. But the cleansing rituals that they give are all themselves also pointing to something else, right? And so before I get to that, it's actually kind of a repeat of the theme I ended with yesterday. I want to remind you, I kind of want to frame this in two basic ways. I want to point out something that is a tension that exists in any community. It would have existed in ancient Israel, and it exists here in the church today. And it exists in your own life individually. I want to kind of take application and apply it to the body. The body, I'm thinking the church, but really it's any community. It would be true of your family. It would be true of your I don't mean politics, but I mean living in the state of Idaho, living in the city of Boise, being an American, the political structures of our world. For a community to live and function together, we have to recognize that there are things that can bring division into that community. There are things that can bring discord into the community and cause the community to divide, which would be catastrophic to the community. And for the community to survive, we have to come up with a way of dealing with those things. Don't turn there for lack of time, but 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul the Apostle gives a tongue lashing to the Corinthian church. 1 Corinthians 5, you can read it later. He chews them out because he's like, guys, in your church, there is a sin going on that not even the Gentiles, and by that he means non-believers, they wouldn't even talk about it. And you guys are allowing it to happen in your church. He says, a man has his daughter's wife. Meaning in the church, there was a man sleeping with his father's wife, I apologize, which both are gross and weird, but so I'm not trying to say, oh, let me give you the less gross, it's different. A man has his father's wife. And Paul's like, and you aren't doing anything about it. So I say all of this because Paul is pointing out that in a community, if an uncleanness comes in, you have to deal with it. You have to remove it or else it will destroy the community. And I love it that in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, you can check that up later. He says, hey guys, I know I was mad and I know I gave you a tongue lashing, but please be merciful to this guy because he has repented. Which, by the way, that's a big one, right? Be merciful to the guy who was sleeping with his father's wife. That's a big one. How do you let somebody back into your community in that? That could be something that could be irreparably broken. Certainly, I have to feel like there's an irreparable breaking in their family. What does Paul say? He says he was unclean. And in this instance, I'm not saying that all uncleanness is sin or anything like that. I want to point out that the uncleanness is a metaphor for sin, because sin is a kind of pollution and a kind of pollution that can destroy the community. So Paul says, let him back in. Let him back in if he repents. And all of that is prefigured by the law. A person is dirty, let them be cleansed. And when they're cleansed, let them back in. Let them back in and be restored fully to the relationship that they have with the community. But guys, there's a second thing I want to point out, and that is inside of our own hearts. We feel unclean when we sin. And sometimes even when we don't sin, there are other things that just make us feel unclean. And that uncleanness will do two things to us. It will drive us away from other people. It will force us to turn inward and away because we feel the sense of shame that our uncleanness has on the community. And it will drive us away from God. And I'm sure if you've lived under the sun for any length of time, you've felt this. I have felt this. When you do something bad, you know the thing to do is to hit your knees in prayer, confess to the Lord and repent. And that is absolutely the last thing in the world you want to do. Because you just feel like you got to get right first. And you feel like you're being hypocritical. And you feel like, how can he possibly allow me to speak to him now when I'm so unclean? Our uncleanness makes us not want to talk to him. That's what it makes us feel. And so what do these things that we're reading teach us? It teaches us that there is a way forward. There is a way out of the uncleanness. There's a way back into the community, but more importantly for us individually, there's a way back into the presence of God. And we're going to talk more about this next week. Next week, I'm excited. Next week is the central chapter of the entire Torah. Literally located in the center. And a lot of people think it's meant to be the center of the book, meaning all the books. It's certainly the center of Leviticus, but it's also the center of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And it is the Day of Atonement. So we'll probably take us more than 1 week to go through that. But what I want to point out is in talking about the Day of Atonement and comparing it to Jesus, in Hebrews chapter 10, the author of Hebrews tells us that we, since we're forgiven and cleansed, should go boldly into the throne room of grace, be unashamed of entering the presence of God, not because we're totally clean in our natural selves, but because we have been cleansed. And how important that is. And so I end, like I said, I'm kind of ending in a similar place to where we were last time, but I want you to turn with me to the book of Mark. It's just another example of essentially the point I made at the end of last class, Mark chapter 5. And this one, I'm sure this was going through your minds if you were familiar with the story, that is, because I don't think you can think about the chapter we just read without having read or without thinking of this passage. Mark chapter 5, verse 25. Now, a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years. That's exactly what we just read about. An irregular menstruation that lasted for 12 years. Think about what this means. Anyone she touches is unclean. She cannot engage in sexual contact if she is following the Torah because she is unclean. She is unclean until the flow stops. She can't even touch another human. I liken this to the lepers we talked about last week, and I gave an example last week of a leper who came to Jesus. Here's a woman who is not allowed to touch people. How horrible would you feel to not be able to engage in touch? She has a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. I think about that. If you know anything about medical history and medicine in antiquity, doctors knew nothing, literally nothing. And there is no question, I know people joke about it today, but there is no question that throughout a good chunk of human history, going to a doctor would likely make your situation worse. And so I like how Mark words it. She suffered many things from the physicians, right? Their attempts to try to treat her and make her whole only made things worse for her. She had spent all that she had. She had spent all of her money. You know, you can think about that. I mean, like, how many times has this happened in human history? People giving everything they have just to try to get better. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd. She touched his garment, for she said, if only I may touch his clothes, I may be made well. She's not allowed to touch him. Not allowed to touch anybody. And yet she is thinking, if I can just touch him, I will be cleansed. Think about what we talked about last week, the leper. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. If you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus touches the lepers. Something you're not allowed to do. He is, people will often say Jesus never violated the law. I mean, he never did anything wrong. He never did anything immoral. In one sense, he never violated the law when it came to these kinds of things because he is God. It makes him fundamentally different from everyone else. He cannot be polluted. But at the same time, he technically is doing what you're not supposed to. He is touching these people, which the Israelites would have thought of as gross. Think about that. That's where I wanted to talk about this tension we live in. You have to protect the community. The community must be protected of uncleanness. I gave the example of the guy who fell and hit his head. People backed up because they're scared. They don't want to get disease. You have to protect the community. But what happens in protecting the community? You make the person feel like garbage and you don't care for them. That's a tough line to walk, and we have to walk it, guys. I'm not here to tell you, let's stop protecting the community. We actually have to do that. That is actually something that has to happen. And if you would ignore it, and I think about this a lot, guys. I've been thinking about this in light of a lot of like the current culture war type stuff, Obviously, it seems to, I'll give you an example. I was driving through McDonald's a while back, and there was a man who was serving me, and he had these really, really long fingernails, and he was very clearly trying to act like a woman. You understand what I'm saying? And I'm talking about like dirt and uncleanness and revulsion. In my heart, I felt revolted at what is going on. In my mind, that is unclean. And I think in terms of our culture, it does, as a community, it has to be changed. We have to change that. That is something we actually have to fight. So I'm not against people who are fighting it, but I assure you that when you interact with somebody and you express that, how are they going to feel? They're going to feel unclean. And they're going to not only hate you, they're going to hate themselves. And they are not going to see Jesus in the midst of that. And one of the things I want you to understand about what Jesus is doing here, he is not destroying the rule. He's not trying to say, look, this doesn't need to happen. We do have to preserve a cleanness. But what is he also doing? He's going and doing the thing nobody else would have done. He's going and touching them. He's going and touching them. He turns around, he goes on, verse 30, who touched my clothes? But his disciples said to him, you see the multitude thronging you, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed in your affliction. One of the things, and I mentioned this last week, that Jesus does In every example that is brought up in the chapters we just read, where a person becomes unclean, Jesus touches them. And not just those chapters, other chapters. The book of Numbers tells us that you cannot touch a dead body. You know what's going to happen immediately after this? Jesus is going to go and he's going to touch a dead little girl. You're not allowed to do that. But what happens? The little girl stands up. Touches a woman with a flow of blood, and what happens? The woman is healed. Touches the person with leprosy, healed. Jesus comes in and he shows us something that has been neglected in the law, in that the law, which is meant to preserve and protect the community, which is good and right, and we cannot shirk it and get rid of it. We have to come to terms with it and deal with it. But he's saying, but it neglects this other thing. But this other thing is in the law, and that is people can be cleansed. And you and me, we will feel unclean. And that feeling of uncleanness can be the single most powerful thing that will keep us from God, which means it is the single most powerful thing that can keep us from the one thing that can cleanse us. And we always need to recognize that. You need to recognize when you are seeing uncleanness in the community and you're saying, I need to fight that. Always remember there's a person there who feels unclean. And that person also needs to see Jesus. And that there is hope that that person can be touched. And that's the beautiful thing here. It's like all this stuff we're talking about is how all these unclean things, if they touch the temple or the tabernacle or the items in the tabernacle or the people, it passes on the pollution. But what does Jesus do? He comes out and he is the one being whose cleanness creates cleanness. He lays his hands and he brings cleanness, and we are called to be that in the world today. Amen? Would you guys stand with me? Prepare for communion. I think it's very interesting that we're holding a cup full of something that is supposed to represent bodily fluid, right? A bodily fluid that, of course, sorry, I didn't mean to put that. I see some of you have the bad image. But it's a bodily fluid that, although in its natural sense would be untouchable, but as with everything else, Jesus's blood is clean. Jesus's blood is something to be touched. Not that this is literally his blood, obviously, but what it represents is that reality. So let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the reality that touching you brings cleanness in our lives. That I know this is just a symbol, the bread and the cup, but Lord, that touching this bread, touching what it symbolizes, the reality, which is you, cleanses our hearts. And drinking and partaking of this cup, which symbolizes your blood, it brings forgiveness of sins. It washes, it cleanses. And we thank you for that reality. And together, we, the body of Christ, represented here in this place on this evening, we partake, trusting and believing in the cleanness which you give to us. And we thank you for it. We pray these things in Jesus' name as we take this bread. And drink this cup. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. God bless you guys. See you next week for the Day of Atonement.